Ask any gamer what their favourite Star Wars video game of all time is, and you'll get a whole bunch of different responses. Ask a millennial, and they'll probably say Battlefront 2, the good one, not the loot box one. But ask their dad, and they might argue for Jedi Knight Dark Forces. Ask their geeky brother, and they'd plump for Knights of the Old Republic. Ask their nan, and they'd say one of the old SNES Super Star Wars games, because they're the coolest nan in the world. It really is a smorgasbord of great games. Yet for the last decade or so, things haven't really felt that way. The silver screen has seen the release of some of the franchise's biggest hits, a swathe of excellent shows have hit streaming services, for the most part anyway. But video games have been somewhat left in limbo. There's been cancelled titles, gacha garbage, and quite simply the worst thing to spawn from Xbox's Kinect. There's also a massive elephant in the room, but don't worry, we'll get to that later. But in 2019, Respawn Entertainment developed a little game called Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, a title that turns cynical gamers from feeling hopeless by a decade of bad decisions to having hope for the future of the franchise. Fallen Order was a commercial and critical hit, the likes of which hadn't been seen by a Star Wars game for years. But why, and more importantly, how, had video games got into this position in the first place? This is the story of how Star Wars games took a nosedive in the 2010s, and why Fallen Order was the turning point the franchise desperately needed. Before we get into it, it's worth looking back at the history of Star Wars video games. The franchise first graced a games console way back in 1982 with Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. Released 2 years after the titular film for the Atari 2600, it was, well, an Atari 2600 game, so it looked and sounded like this. The 1980 Star Wars games weren't all bad though. The original Star Wars arcade game was a fun FPS, and Return of the Jedi Death Star Battle showed consoles could support a fun Star Wars title. But it wasn't until the 90s that truly great ones began to emerge. The Super Star Wars series brought the first 3 films to the world of platformers, with some exceptional 16-bit games that remain a favourite of retro gamers the world over. TIE Fighter is still heralded by many as the pinnacle of space combat games. And the previously mentioned Jedi Knight Dark Forces and its sequels brought the thrills of Doom and Duke Nukem to the Star Wars universe, throwing in a lightsaber for good measure. This is how Star Wars cemented itself as a franchise that could produce brilliant video games in a whole range of genres. The following decade only furthered this legacy. There was one of the best racing games of its era in Pod Racer, an underrated gem of a strategy title in Empire at War, the glorious multiplayer shooter Battlefront and its sequel, and one of the best sci-fi RPGs ever made in Knights of the Old Republic. And that's not even getting into the expansive LEGO universe that almost single-handedly kept Star Wars video games above the parapet for a whole generation. But then suddenly, it all just stopped. Until 2013, the Star Wars franchise had unsurprisingly been held by George Lucas's own software production studio, LucasArts, with games either being developed or exec-produced by the company. This meant the games always had to have at least the tertiary backing of George Lucas himself, and hence the games always had some air of quality control, and more significantly, honoured the legacy of Star Wars as a property. However, in 2012, Disney bought out LucasArts, who subsequently licensed all future titles to gaming giant EA in a 10-year exclusivity deal. This was a massive shake-up for both the companies and people involved. It was also the worst thing to happen to Star Wars video games in the franchise's history. The signs were already there from the beginning of the decade. Star Wars The Old Republic was released in 2011. It was an MMO looking to compete with the Goliath of World of Warcraft, using the Star Wars license as its USP. But at this point, the market was already saturated, and as many publishers began to realise, players only had time for one MMO, and it wasn't going to be theirs. And then there was Kinect Star Wars, a game so catastrophically ill-advised it has to be seen to be believed. Yeah, that's real. Disney and EA stepping in was the moment everything Star Wars fans had feared the most. Their first decision was to cancel a raft of games already in development, most significantly Star Wars 1313, an action-adventure game in the style of Uncharted. In their place came a whole host of licensed titles of other games, like Angry Birds Star Wars and Club Penguin Rebel Takeover, as well as a slew of other mobile and portable games with as much charm as Greedo. But it was in the AAA space where things were most troubling. 2015's reboot of the Star Wars Battlefront franchise wasn't a bad game at all. It was well designed, looked and sounded impressive, and was fun to play. A modern Star Wars FPS made a great deal of sense, and the team at DICE knew how to make fantastic shooters, having developed the Battlefield series for over a decade. But it still suffered from a distinct lack of stuff to do, with a lot of the game's content shaved off to be added to the game's season pass or sold off as DLC. Frustrating considering you'd already paid £60 for essentially a game's framework, but many were still okay with it. What they weren't okay with was what EA tried to pull off with the sequel. 2017's Battlefront 2 was, in short, a complete disaster. Again, nothing to do with the actual gameplay, but in this case the publishers took the egregious monetization to a level that very nearly broke the AAA industry as a whole. Everything from weapons and ships to beloved characters and iconic outfits were buried in loot boxes. Well, unless you wanted to grind literal hundreds of hours for a chance to play as Luke Skywalker. Those who paid for these loot crates would essentially end up with the best gear and become unstoppable in multiplayer, rendering it pointless for most. Critics and fans were fuming. A response from EA's community team on Reddit on the topic became the single most downvoted comment in the site's history. And rightly so. EA had essentially tried to copy the FIFA Ultimate Team model for a Star Wars game, and in the process completely ruined it. Now, if there had been other Star Wars games fans could have turned to instead to satiate their appetite, then it might not have been as bad. But there wasn't. This was it. And this was Which brings us to Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Having been announced around the time of Battlefront 2's release, fans, unsurprisingly, had reservations about what the game would actually be. It came with some serious pedigree. It was being developed by Respawn Entertainment, who created the excellent Titanfall series and were led by industry legend Vince Zampella, and was being directed by Stig Asmussen, who'd headed up the original God of War series. But it was still being published by EA, a company who had already proven many times that they were more interested in monetizing the Star Wars brand than actually releasing a game people would cherish. Surely they'd try and force microtransactions into this single-player RPG. They were definitely going to find a way to introduce some kind of grinding system that forced you to pay up for your favorite colored lightsaber or outfit for your cute little robot buddy. Right? And they couldn't possibly look at what other great single-player games of the time were doing and want to put them in their own game without making a complete mess of it. Right? Wrong. Very wrong. Jedi Fallen Order was a critical success for a host of reasons. It brought a new style of combat to the Star Wars gaming universe, one more akin to games like Dark Souls than the dark dealings of the EA money machine. There was a parry and deflect system that felt fluid and visceral, and incredibly rewarding to pull off. Levels were intricately designed and had an almost Metroidvania-like structure, with new powers granted throughout levels giving access to previously unexplored areas, encouraging and rewarding exploration. There was a good variety of enemies, and set pieces designed to test your skills without being too punishing. There were boss fights that tested your skills and forced you to adapt and learn their patterns, rather than simply button mashing your way through. And the story was really good. Being its own self-contained narrative of a young Jedi aiming to rebuild the Jedi Order whilst being hunted down by the Galactic Empire, rather than trying to shoehorn in well-known characters without context or emotional connection, really worked in the game's favour. Fallen Order wasn't just a brilliant Star Wars game, it was a brilliant game full stop. And being a Jedi, you had access to Force powers, which meant you could do stuff like this. But most importantly of all, Jedi Fallen Order did the thing that some may have forgotten, or not ever really known, that Star Wars games could be fantastic. The universe had always been ripe for exploration, and Fallen Order provided that sense of wonder magnificently, without compromising itself with video game tropes that could only drag it down. You got to live out your childhood fantasy of being a Jedi, hopping between planets on galactic adventures, defeating the Empire and facing off against the strongest the universe had to offer, just like you'd always dreamed when watching the films. And you got to do it all without throwing actual money at it just so you could use a purple lightsaber. Fallen Order has shifted the landscape of Star Wars video games almost single-handedly. From a decade of games that left players fearful over whether the titles will provide great experiences ever again, we now find ourselves genuinely excited about what the future holds for the franchise. Respawn have already confirmed they're developing a brand new single-player Star Wars FPS in the mold of games like Doom Eternal and Wolfenstein: The New Order. David Cage and his team at Quantic Dream are working on Star Wars Eclipse, a narrative adventure in the style of their previous titles Detroit Become Human and Heavy Rain. Ubisoft has an open world game in development, and the classic Knights of the Old Republic is being remade from the ground up for this excited new audience. It's genuinely an amazing time to be a fan of Star Wars games, and that's not something we've been able to say for quite a long time. Which brings us to Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Respawn's sequel to Fallen Order. The landscape for this release is a far cry from its predecessor now, and gamers everywhere are excited to see how Respawn push on from the first game and make this one even better. And it's precisely because of Fallen Order that we're now in this position. It reminded us of what we'd always known, that Star Wars video games deserve to be loved, and fans of the series deserve games that represent the franchise properly. It doesn't deserve to be a cash cow that relentlessly exploits the passionate fandom for every penny they have. Star Wars video games aren't there to be bastardized into vassals from which greedy moneymen can expunge capital for the sake of shareholders. They have always been labours of love for their creators, and opportunities for players to spend more time in the universe they adore. And they can still be successful. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order proved that. And let's get excited for the future of Star Wars games. For the first time in a long time, the future of the IP is looking bright. To paraphrase Yoda, the future is always in motion.